Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today we have a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Robert M. Price, who I'm going to be, my friend Dr. Robert M. Price, I'm going to be giving a brief introduction to right now. Dr. Robert M. Price has 2 PhDs, one in New Testament theology from Drew University, 3 master's degrees from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and he has written at least 20 books, some of them being The Amazing Colossal Apostle, The Search for the Historical Paul, The Pre-Nicene New Testament, and The Holy Fable. Bob is also an outspoken Republican and a Trump supporter, which I am not. Him and I are big comic book fans and comic book movie fans and science fiction fans. We also like both Marvel and DC, but I personally prefer DC over Marvel. He has done 20 debates with various Christian apologists, including Dr. William Lane Craig, and has also recently debated Dr. Bart Ehrman on the historicity of Jesus. Me and Bob also have something in common. We both debated James White, but I don't like James White. Me and Bob are working on a book together called The Bible According to Robert M. Price and Ehteshaam Gulam, which should be out in 2020 or something like that. Bob also, and we're also working on a podcast called Ehteshaam Gulam and Robert M. Price at the Movies. So that should also be out soon. Me and Robert M. Price also have something in common. We're both friends with Bart Ehrman, the author of Misquoting Jesus and Forge and stuff like that. Bob also has a Patreon account. What's your Patreon account?
Well, I guess
just Robert M. Price.
That's
right. Okay. So it's Patreon/Robert M. Price. Or you can search it up on his Facebook or whatever, or search it up on your own. Bob also hosts the Bible Geek, the Human Bible, and does the Lovecraft Geek podcast, which are all available either on his website or on his Patreon account. So, Bob, thanks for coming out.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. So usually when I do these things, I usually let my guests give a brief introduction in their own words about themselves. So why don't you give us a brief introduction to yourself and why you left Christian fundamentalism?
Well, as I always like to say, in the style of 50s teenage drive-in monster movies, I was a teenage fundamentalist and derived great pleasure therefrom. I had a good time as a Bible-believing fundamentalist, great friends. I don't look back on it as anything I had to escape from, as if I was a member of the People's Temple or something. But the love for the Bible and the curiosity about it that you gain as a fundamentalist eventually led me to repudiate fundamentalism, because I found that it was hampering and hindering my understanding of the Bible, because it put such a theological straitjacket on it that you couldn't. It puts you in the position of saying, well, it seems to mean this, but boy, if it does, the Bible's not inerrant and infallible, so it can't mean that. And I figured, wait a minute, don't we always say that it's the plain sense of the text that is the authoritative one? There's something amiss here, and eventually I just realized that the biblical authority theory just did not answer the facts, and even worse for me, the apologetics trying to prove that Jesus rose from the dead and that the Gospels were accurate. I once placed a lot of emphasis on that, but the more I studied it, the more holes I found in it, until I finally decided I've just been listening to one side on this. I need to look over the whole landscape, and when I did, I found it was much bigger than I thought. Now the question question of, I'm not a believer in God, but that's a whole different issue to me. That's really more of a philosophical question. I mean, there could be, as Benjamin Warfield said, you could have Christianity with no Bible at all, and though it happens we have one, well, that's right. And you could have theism, a belief in God, without any particular religion. So these things are all independent issues, but I eventually decided I just can't really buy the notion of a deity either. So I remain friendly to religion and religious people, but I'm a kind of a friendly dissenter, you might say, the loyal opposition. So I don't have a vendetta against religion, etc. My debates and my books really are just attempts to set the record straight. I don't debate people on whether God exists. That's really not what I care about. I let people believe whatever they decide to believe. It's none of my business. But when certain people pose as experts on the Bible and start giving out basically religious propaganda rather than scholarship, I feel reluctantly I must step into the ring and try to get the facts straight to no particular end. I don't care what people do with the knowledge, but I feel like I need to stand up for consistent biblical criticism.
Let's do a quick. Okay, so can you give us a little bit about the Christ myth theory? I know you and Dr. Richard Carrier, who's also a friend of mine and a friend of the show. In fact, Richard Carrier was my first guest in episode 1 when I started doing this. Recently we had a panel discussion with Richard, Bob, and me, and that should be out whenever I have the time, if my work schedule allows. So, edit it and put it on YouTube. But I don't know when I can do that. But anyways, you and Richard Carrier are the only two who have PhDs who say that Jesus didn't exist, when almost all scholars, whether liberal or conservative, hold that Jesus existed. Why do you hold to the Christ myth theory when hardly any scholars agree with that?
Well, there are a few others. Thomas L. Thompson, who's an Old Testament scholar, and the king of the so-called Old Testament minimalists, who thinks that really the whole thing is fiction, and that neither King David nor Jesus existed. He would count. Also, Thomas L. Brody, just so happens they're both Thomas L's. Brody is a Dominican monk who came out as saying he just believed there was no historical Jesus. A lot of his work is dedicated to showing that the Gospels are really based on Old Testament stories and rewrites, which I've with acknowledging his work, have embraced as well. And there may be a couple of others with earned doctorates in that, but let me just go back to Old Testament minimalism for a second. It wasn't too long ago that people would defend that there was a historical Abraham and a historical Moses. Most scholars, including some conservative ones, had given up on the idea of a historical Adam. If you're a conservative, you'd say it's symbolic. If you're more critical, you'd say it's a myth, but it amounts to the same thing. But ever since, I guess, sometime in the 70s, Old Testament scholarship has made a huge change in the direction of what is called minimalism. The old argument that the Bible is vindicated by archaeology has just collapsed, and the absence of evidence of any of the Old Testament, and I would even say New Testament stories, that has really proven fatal. And now the rule among Old Testament critics is that there was no Abraham, there was no Moses, there was no David, etc. That you only pass into history with characters in 2 Kings, Omri, and so on. There you have some history, but most of it is just foundation legends and so on. Well, that didn't take very long for Old Testament scholars to move toward a heavily mythicist approach. I think the same thing is beginning to happen with the New Testament. In fact, it might even be better to call the Christ myth theory New Testament minimalism, because it's the same sort of thing. And other minimalist scholars like Philip R. Davies seem to be leaning in that direction. Yeah, why don't we ask the same questions about the Gospels? And maybe we should, maybe we are. And if that's the case, I would say Richard Carrier, Thomas L. Thompson, Thomas L. Brody, me, and some few others are the vanguard. I hate to say stuff like that because it implies I'm trying to glorify myself, and that's absurd. But I mean, we would be the first fruits, shall I say? And I think more and more people will come around to it, but it's going to be slower than in the case of the Old Testament, because people have most scholars are either influenced by a Christian upbringing or still are some kind of Christian, and boy, they just can't let go of some kind of Jesus. So I can't help thinking that is one thing that retards the progress on this. But as to why anybody would become a New Testament minimalist, embrace the Christ myth theory, there's a few important points. One of them, which though striking is probably not the most important, is the utter absence of any mention of Jesus in any non-Christian source in the relevant centuries. Like you have in the 2nd century somebody like Tacitus who refers to Jesus. He's talking about Christianity, and he says, in case you don't know, it was started by one Christus or Crestus, depending on which manuscript you read, and who was crucified under the prefect Pontius Pilate. This isn't really helpful to establish the existence of a historical Jesus, because whether or not there was one, Tacitus, well, he was in no position to know. He's simply reflecting what Christians say. Like if you knew nothing about Islam and somebody was explaining it to you, they'd say, well, the founder was the Prophet Muhammad, etc., etc. They're telling you what the Muslim understanding is. They're not really even weighing in on the historicity of it. Or Buddhism, well, it was founded by a guy named Gautama Buddha. It's just the story, right? And
this is not going to work out that way.
So that's the same with Tacitus. There's a famous passage in the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 90s AD or CE, if you prefer, where he mentions Jesus. But this passage has really been demonstrated to be a Christian forgery, interpolated into the text of Josephus, and almost certainly by Eusebius, a 4th century Christian ecclesiastical historian. You know, the idea of the victors write the history. Well, this was his ecclesiastical history as a kind of an authorized biography of Christianity. Whenever I hear that, I start to worry. Authorized, the party line, and it looks like he created this passage. Josephus should have mentioned Jesus, so let's say he did. And so there's no real evidence of Jesus from the time that would be important, namely the ostensible lifetime of Jesus, which would be something like 4 to 6 BC or BCE, all the way up to about 30 CE or AD. There's just nothing there. Now, why would that be? Well, the problem with this is that if Jesus were the miracle-working Superman of the Gospels, who finally had to be crucified because he was creating such a stir, why would this not be mentioned? I mean, there are really shrimpy, insignificant messiahs that were mentioned, revolutionary rabble-rousers, rebels against Rome. why would this much more spectacular figure earn no place among any kind of known writers? And there's really a lot of stuff from that period. Well, the answer that mainstream New Testament scholars tend to give is they will say, well, admittedly, the gospel Jesus is the Christ of faith, embellished, blown up from the Jesus of history. And to most people, Jesus would have been known simply as a faith healer and an exorcist, some kind of a sage. There were loads of those, or a dime a dozen in the ancient world. And would they have given him any special notice? Well, no. I mean, do you think American history books are going to have a chapter on Oral Roberts or Kenneth Copeland? Highly unlikely. That's superficially plausible, but then you got to ask, why did Christians make much of this modest and this negligible character? And I like to, being a comic book fan, I like the analogy of saying, if somebody wants to determine if there was a historical Superman who came from the planet Krypton with powers beyond those of ordinary mortals and so on. Somebody says, was there a Superman? You know, I bet there was. Wait a minute, he's only mentioned in comic books. There's no newspapers with Superman defeats Lex Luthor. Well, and then you whittle him down. You say, the historical Superman was a mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper. He was Clark Kent. And the faith in him ballooned up into Superman. But then you got to ask, why? I mean, what's the big deal about Clark Kent? You know, there's no Clark Kent comics. There's no action comics featuring Clark Kent, intrepid reporter. It's the same, and you know, even saying there was a Clark Kent would simply be a hypothesis. And that's the problem I have with this. If the historical Jesus didn't merit attention by non-Christians, why did he merit attention among Christians? How did this thing blow up from pretty much nothing? So that is a problem. Now, what about all the miracles and so forth, and the biggie, the resurrection from the dead? Well, it doesn't get mentioned in sober history, but there are loads of parallels to this in Greco-Roman mystery religions, even in the Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern pre-biblical stories of dying and rising gods, and of rituals in which one sort of patched oneself into the holy story. You baptized your dying and rising with Christ. A lot of the Mithraist religion, the religions of Osiris and Hercules, they all had such participatory initiation rites. They featured dying and rising gods. Baal in the Old Testament was one. Osiris in Egyptian religion. Marduk even. So you got to ask yourself, if these guys weren't real, why believe that the Christian version was? I mean, it's so similar. He's put to death by his enemies, and even the detail of women devotees searching for the body and finding it, and post-mortem appearances and all this. These appear in myths and legends. There's no known historical instance of this. So to say that, Osiris, Baal, Hercules, they're just myths, but Jesus, it really happened with him. To go back to my beloved comics again, this sounds to me like somebody saying, you Captain Marvel, your Martian Manhunter, your Thor, these are just fictions, but Superman, he really existed. Why would you think that? Right? Why? It's just special pleading. My favorite is the real one. And this was not an easy conclusion for me to come to. I used to think the Christ myth theory was crazy. But then I began to look into it and read the people that made these arguments. And I guess the thing that really pushed me over the edge was the work of Brody and others, who showed in great detail how virtually every story in the Gospels could very plausibly be understood as a rewrite of an Old Testament story about David, Moses, Joshua, Elijah, Elisha. And they showed this in terms of the vocabulary. Sometimes the Gospel story even uses the same phraseology as the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And once you discount all of that, you don't really have much of anything left. I mean, that doesn't prove that they were copied from the Old Testament, but it pretty much vitiates the argument that you can trust those Gospels. You can't. And of course, I'm not attacking the Gospels, right? I love the Gospels. I love the Bible. But I feel like that those who defend it as all history, an analogy for this would be, suppose you had a bunch of cultists, whatever, who insisted that the Olympian gods are real and that Achilles was real, and one version of his story has him raised from the dead. Suppose somebody said, yeah, hallelujah, praise Zeus, and we got to read the Iliad and the Odyssey as literal history because it's divinely inspired, which a lot of the ancients did think. What would classics scholars think of that? They love the Iliad and the Odyssey, or they wouldn't have gone into that business, right? They would be the ones to say, hold on a second, you're getting this totally wrong. They wouldn't say this because they hated Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's because they love it. They don't want to see it misconstrued and misrepresented, and that's the way it is with biblical critics generally, and Christ mythicists. I don't know of any of them that hate the Jesus character and hate Christianity. It's just that they love the Bible more and want to see it treated fairly. That's the case with me. I finally had to decide, do I want to go with honesty about the Bible or faith? And of course I chose the former. And so the Christ myth theory is just an extreme example of that. People don't like the word extreme, I understand, but what I mean is the most consistent approach without pampering it and putting on blinders because there's a sacred cow there that you want to preserve. You can't let preferences like that control it. And I think biblical criticism consistently followed would lead you to mythicism. One last thing, it is a theory, right? The idea that Jesus didn't exist, it's not provable. I can imagine ways that future manuscripts discoveries could debunk it. I don't think it's a dogma. To me, it just seems like the theory that makes the most sense of the evidence. Historians are at least not supposed to have dogmatic beliefs. You've always got to keep your theorizing probabilistic, provisional, knowing that it might be overturned, and if it does, that's fine.
Okay. I'm Muslim, and I think you already know that. But and then in Islam, Jesus is accepted, but he's not like the Superman. He's like the Clark Kent. So is it reasonable? Is it possible to hold the claim that Jesus did exist, but those other things that would make him Superman, like the resurrection, the ascension, what you may call the divinity, all that, the Son of God, Trinity, all that. Would you say that that was added later on? And then wouldn't it make more sense to put it in my own analogy, using your analogy? Because Jesus was the Clark Kent, and then eventually he evolved into the Superman. Is that a feasible? Is that a reasonable thesis? Or
well, things like that have happened. In fact,
because I do believe there was a historical Jesus. So
it does. The reason I think that that has not happened in the case of Jesus, but rather that he began as conceived as a heavenly deity and who never came to earth. And actually, the progress went in the other direction. He became humanized later. The reason I think that rather than that he was a historical individual that became a god, much like Ali, what was he, the nephew and adopted,
the fourth caliph of Islam.
Yeah, there are quasi-Muslim sects to this day that believe that he is the incarnation of Allah, or even a member of a trinity of incarnate versions of Allah. Now, we have every reason to believe that Ali existed, and that in his life, one story says that in his own lifetime, people were worshiping him, and that he said, "Hey, look, I never said this. I don't buy it," and he executed somebody that was spreading this heresy, and the others who believed it said, "Well, who but a god would have the authority to do that?" It's just like in Monty Python's Life of Brian. Only the true Messiah denies his divinity. Well, so that can happen, but with Ali and various Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, these people, Cyrus of Persia, they left as they like to say today, a footprint in secular history. Like Caesar Augustus, also called the Son of God, the Savior, etc. He miraculously born and became a god. He is tied up with Roman history. There's no way there was no Caesar Augustus. There's no way there was no Cyrus of Persia. There's just too much that ties him to the historical continuum. Just, military history, political stuff, and so forth. But with Jesus, there is not. Now, it seems at first that there is, because, didn't Herod the Great try to kill him? Didn't Pontius Pilate, who was well known to history, didn't he condemn him to death? Didn't Caiaphas, the high priest, condemn him? They've even found Caiaphas's tomb. There's no doubt that he existed. Herod Antipas, we know a lot about him. Archelaus, mentioned in Matthew, sure, he existed. But scholars long ago, with no interest in the Christ myth theory, leveled really damning criticisms against those stories taken as history. The attempt of Herod the Great to kill the infant Jesus is really crisscrossed with improbabilities and absurdities. Actually, there are two different versions within the nativity story of what the Star of Bethlehem is, and just all kinds of narrative implausibilities. Like, why didn't the angel tell all the other parents in Bethlehem to get their kids out of the way? Who cares about them? Those are just paper characters in the story, and the whole thing seems transparently based on Josephus's version of the nativity of Moses in various details. I guess it could have happened. We know Herod the Great was a paranoid, murdering tyrant. This would have been in character, but that points both ways. We have a catalog of his atrocities from ancient writers. This isn't one of them. Caiaphas, there's confusion in the Gospel of John about how long the high priests reigned. He has more than one high priest at the same time. The trial narrative of Jesus is utterly implausible. His capital trial takes place on Passover Eve. This is like the Pope skipping Christmas Eve Mass to attend a trial. It just wouldn't happen, and so on and so on. Pilate, well, I say we know a good bit about him because he outraged Jews every chance he got. He was a real anti-Semite. Would he have bent over backwards to try to rescue Jesus from the wrath of the mob, and then found himself unable to? He's intimidated by a bunch of pool hall rowdies in the street. It just is impossible. It seems utterly implausible as history, and so at the very points at which you think Jesus might be attached to secular history, the connections dissolve. They're no less legendary. So there could have been a Jesus, but it just seems to me there is really no solid reason to think so.
But my thesis is possible, right?
It's possible. I just think I find it implausible, but it's not absurd. I don't mean to say that.
Oh, okay. So it's not unreasonable to
No.
Okay, so can you give us a few reasons why the New Testament documents are not historically reliable? Christian fundamentalist, or as Bob would say, was a teenage fundamentalist. Apologists would say that the Gospels and Acts were Greco-Roman biographies, recollected memories, etc. Can you give us some reasons why the New Testament documents, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, etc., are not historically reliable and fact?
Well, one major reason is what Brody and several other scholars say, that the stories look like rewrites of Old Testament stories, and then you have to ask, what is more likely, that a man was walking on water, changing water into wine, healing the sick with a word, all this stuff, raising the dead, or that somebody rewrote a bunch of well-known stories where ancient legendary heroes had done this? There's no way it's going to be considered more probable that, he raised Lazarus from the dead after 4 days and he stilled the storm and all that. We weren't there. We don't know what happened. All you can do is to say, what's more probable? Another problem is that the Gospels do not read like eyewitness testimony, and by that I mean, in the ancient world, they knew what we would call table talk. They knew what that was. Like, we have table talk of Martin Luther. The people that knew him wrote down. Yeah, I remember when Martin Luther used to say, "I wish people had stopped confusing me with Lex Luthor," or whatever. Salvation's by grace through faith. And they say, yeah, Luther used to say this and that and the other thing because they were there. We even have table talk of Hitler. I read a book about the impenetrable philosopher the process, Whitehead, the process philosopher, by a friend of his. He used to hang around and have dinner discussions with him. Whitehead used to say this and that, and there's some gems in there. That's not the Gospels. The ancients knew about that, though, because we have a plainly fictitious work from the 2nd century called the Acts of John, which contains a passage or a section called the Preaching of John, where John, now aged and an apostle, is telling his converts, yeah, I remember when Jesus used to do this or say that. When you look at the content, it's obviously fictitious. It's wilder than the Gospels. But the point is, that writer knew what eyewitness testimony would sound like, but the Gospels are not like that. They're short little nuggets, little anecdotes and episodes like we find about the Greek philosophers, and research into higher education in the Hellenistic world shows that students were assigned the task that they'd be studying Socrates or Diogenes or whoever, and the teacher would say, now I want you to write up a little anecdote where the philosopher addresses so-and-so question to see if you have a good grasp of what he would say. You know, like people say, what would Jesus do? Well, what would Diogenes have said about this, do you think? So students would concoct these things, admittedly fictional. Well, that looks kind of like what the gospel anecdotes are. And so it's easy to imagine that there are other ways we would have gotten this stuff than historical reporting, or as in Islam, fairly shortly after the Prophet, there were scholars who noticed that there were tens of thousands of hadiths, these supposedly oral reports of what the Prophet did and said, which supplemented the Quran. He's addressing things that don't come up in the Quran. Well, these devout Muslims knew there is no way all of this could go back to the Prophet Muhammad. And so they set up criteria to weed out the fake ones and still came up with thousands of hadith. Well, and it was even known at the time that, in fact, there's I can almost remember the wording, there is no circumstance in which a holy man is more likely to lie than in matters of religion. And there's even a hadith where Muhammad is made to say that people will be creating these, but if they promote piety, that's all right. And I think the same thing accounts for the Gospels, especially when you find that Jesus is made to say 3 or 4 different things about fasting. Now, what was he, a multiple personality? He keep changing his mind? No, it's obvious that people had their own opinions, and to drive them home, they'd say, well, yeah, this isn't just my opinion. The Son of God said this. And there's just too many other possibilities, and the deck is stacked against the historical accuracy of the Gospels.
Oh, okay. Yeah, can we know anything about other figures in Christianity? Did the disciples exist? Peter, John, James, etc. And how did the travels of their deaths get recorded? Because Christian fundamentalists like William Lane Craig, Michael Conan, and other Christian fundamentalists would say that the disciples died for their belief in the resurrection. People like Barterman and Richard Carrier have already responded to this argument. But Bob, what are your thoughts on, the claim of the disciples and, their history and stuff?
We know nothing about the supposed 12 disciples. The Bible doesn't even tell us hardly a thing. With James, the son of Zebedee, we're told in Acts that he was beheaded, and yet there's a conflicting tradition in Papias that it was not only James but his brother John. They were both killed at the same time, whereas other Christians say, oh no, John lived to be 100 years old. And we hear absolutely nothing about the others, with the seeming exception of Peter. But Peter appears to be a kind of Dr. Watson figure in Sherlock Holmes. He does this masterful deduction of who the villain is and what happened. And Arthur Conan Doyle has to explain to the reader how Holmes did this. So he has Holmes' sidekick, Dr. Watson, ask for clarification. I say, Holmes, how did you deduce that little Sally was the Shropshire slasher? And then Holmes says, elementary, my dear Watson, and he explains the whole thing for the benefit of the reader. In Buddhist stories, you have Ananda, the disciple of the Buddha, who's a bit thick-headed headed, and he will bring up some good idea, he thinks, only to have the Buddha say, no, that's not going to work. This is the way we're going to do it. Peter is always the same sort of character. Gee, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother? What, a big 7 times? No, 70 times 7. Again and again, Peter comes up looking like an idiot because he's supposed to. He's giving Jesus, he's the straight man. He poses a question for Jesus to answer for the benefit of the reader. Gee, Lord, what did you mean by that parable? He says, what, you don't get this parable? How you can understand any of my parables? Okay, here we go. The sower is the Son of Man. And so he's just he's like a footnote. It's like, okay, reader, we know you're wondering about this. Here's Peter's, he's asking your question. And which is one big reason Peter looks like such a moron. And it's not the poor guy's fault. He's just a fictional prop. Now, there might have been such a person, but the Gospels can't even quite agree on the names of the 12, and some of them sound suspiciously like the desposunoi, the heirs of Jesus, so-called James the Just, Simon Bar Cleophas, and so on, Judas, Thomas, and so forth. Robert Eisenman has come up with what I think is a convincing theory that the original or the earlier group of authorities were the so-called Brethren of Jesus, and that they got fictively divided up. Several of the 12 kind of reduced. Some of them have the same name even. A couple of Simons, a couple of Jameses, and so on. They are expanded, multiplied versions of the original pillars, as they're called, Cephas, James, and John. But we know nothing about these people, and even the idea that the Brethren of Jesus, as Carrier and Wells and many others say, that is not necessarily a statement about biological descent, and there are many options as to what that might be. And the single passage where James is called the brother of the Lord, there's a good argument that that's an interpolation anyway. So we really know nothing about him. Now, one weird parallel that might be relevant, Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, she claimed to be in touch with the ascended masters, these immortal adepts who lived in the mountains of Tibet. They've transcended mortality, and she had all sorts of fancy names for them, Kuthumi, Moria El, etc., 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 a bunch of them. Research has shown that, and she, oh boy, what a character she was. She would claim to have revelations from these guys that would flutter down from a vent in the ceiling. And she said, oh, here's another revelation. Well, that was hokum, but somebody researched and found out that these guys did actually exist. They were just friends of hers. She just made them into these, gave them these funny names, and said that they were immortals in Tibet and so forth. So there was a historical basis, but it was totally contrived. In the same way, it's possible that behind the fictive apostles, there were church leaders of the 2nd century who tried to associate themselves. As for Paul, I think that Hermann Dettering and various others are right that Paul is the same guy also known as Simon Magus, Simon the Sorcerer, because when he is described in the Charagmata Petru, the preachings of Peter, And even in the book of Acts, it's pretty obvious we're talking about Paul under another name. The law is over, and salvation is by grace, not by works of the law, and so on. And Peter confronts him, much as in the book of Galatians, when they tangle at Antioch. And I think, that's right, that he was known as Paul in some circles, and Simon Magus in others. So I think, and Simon is mentioned by Josephus as a kind of Rasputin figure connected to the Herodians and so forth. And so I think there was a historical Paul, just that he's Simon Magus.
Oh, okay. So we don't have any reliable records about them believing the resurrection.
I'm sorry. The only reason anybody even thought the 12 were martyred.
Because Richard Carey said there's nothing in the New Testament that says they died for their belief.
That's right. And when you look at the books that say they were, these are wildly unhistorical, fanciful legends where Andrew and Matthias go preach to the cannibals, and Paul is executed by Nero, but then immediately rises from the dead and threatens Nero. You're next. And just all kinds of crazy, fabulous stuff that is much wilder than anything in the New Testament. You're going to take this as history? And even if we knew they were martyred, and we don't know that, you'd have to ask if the Roman inquisitors were in the habit of giving you a chance to recant. We don't know that. I mean, from what we read in the sources we have, I said, I hear you're a Christian, come with me. We don't know that they were like, giving the thumb screws. Now, you renounce that Jesus guy, right? No, I'm not going to do it. Ouch! Well, there's no reason to think this happened. And so it's just amazing to me what apologists will resort to.
Oh, okay. That brings me to the church fathers. Are they, in your opinion, are they reliable, and or as Richard Carrier said, are they too late? And obviously, if there was a historicization of an originally mythical Jesus, this was well in the rear view mirror by the time that the church fathers were writing. So Christian apologists or fundamentalists would say that the church fathers were like the isnad in Islamic terms, in terms of things like the isnad of the disciples or whatever.
That's a good parallel, but it cuts both ways because...
I'm sorry, for my viewers who don't know what an isnad is, in Islam, we have something called an isnad. Isnad is a chain of transmission for hadith. Hadiths were...
I got it from this guy who got it from that guy who got it from this one,
Isnads were in hadith, and hadith are like sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. So, in case you don't know what isnad was, but I'm sorry about that.
That's good. In Chronicles, they were used as credentials. Oh, yeah, this guy has the wherewithal to be a priest because he was descended from Aaron way back, and they'll give you all the links. Or the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, which completely contradict one another and are stuffed with repetitive.
Don't they go all the way back to Adam?
Luke's does. That's right. And he's got all kinds of priestly names, Levitical names in a genealogy that is supposed to trace Jesus back to David, who was from the tribe of Judah. And so they claimed, like they would say, for instance, the church fathers, that Irenaeus got this tradition about the writing of the Gospels from Papias.
Aren't there 4 Gospels because of that? Church father said that there's like 4 pillars holding the earth.
Irenaeus. Now, my guess is that he's just looking for a ridiculous rationale for excluding the ones he didn't like. But he said, well, there's 4 winds, aren't there? The cherubim in Ezekiel have 4 faces, don't they? So there's got to be 4 Gospels and 4 only. Kidding me. And the same thing with epistles. There have to be 7 epistles because there are 7 at the beginning of the book of Revelation.
Sure.
And so they figure, well, there are 13 with Paul's name on it, but if he wrote Hebrews, that would give us 2 groups of 7. So Paul must have written Hebrews too. It's just the way the ancients thought just won't hold up anymore.
Okay, that brings me to Paul. Now you brought up some interesting points about in your debate with Barter and on did Jesus exist? You brought up something interesting about Paul's epistles being forgeries and stuff like that. That's the first time I heard about it, and so I didn't. But as time went on, I didn't do any research on it. But so can you give us some brief thoughts on the Pauline epistles, as you say, they're forgeries, or why they're not reliable?
There's a bunch of reasons that people just ignore. One of them is that more than once Paul talks about traditions that he has handed on to his churches. But if you think about the imagined scene,
like the authorship of Galatians and stuff like that.
The thing is, if Paul actually wrote these letters, this is anachronistic. You couldn't really say he had passed on traditions. Rather, this attests that whoever wrote this attributed certain long-standing traditions to Paul, and now he's claiming to be Paul. It's very much like in 2 Peter, where the writer is posing as Simon Peter and says, we were eyewitnesses. But then later on in the letter, he says, I know there are people mocking you because the second coming hasn't happened. He says, well, you got to remember, as your apostles foretold this would happen. Aren't you supposed to be one of these apostles? And you're referring to them as figures of the past? Oops! It's the same sort of thing there. There are retrospective references, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, where he says, Paul, he says, I founded the Corinthian church, and Apollos and Cephas watered it, and so on. Each has done his share. This sounds like a guy talking about the labors of figures of the past that are finished, and yet it's in the name of Paul. That's one problem. Speaking of anachronisms, 1 Thessalonians and Romans both seem to speak first about God having abandoned Jews, at least temporarily, because they have decisively rejected the gospel. Paul, if he died in 60 or so, couldn't possibly have seen things that way. It was way too early to say Christianity and Judaism had parted ways. Now, there were still Christians going to synagogue in the 6th century when John Chrysostom told them to cut it out. So there's a problem. But then, how do we know God has washed his hands of Israel? Something decisive must have happened. Well, it had to be the fall of Jerusalem. But this is like over a decade after the death of Paul, and somebody just has gotten it screwed up. But another problem is there is a bunch of places where you have one view in one chapter, and in the very next chapter the opposite is argued. Can women preach and prophesy in church? Yes, they can. No, they can't. Is there a secret wisdom that we preach? Oh, no, it's just Christ crucified. But then, but among the mature, we do preach the gnosis unknown to the archons and so on. Should Christians eat meat that had been offered to idols before it was sold in the marketplace? Sure, why not? It's just meat. Don't give it that much thought. But then, oh no, you do that and you'll be like the Israelites at Baal Peor, who were all killed by God in the thousands because they had participated in idol worship. Which is it? And that's the worst example because it's such a long letter. But there are similar things in Romans chapters 9 through 11 about how God's plan for Israel. There are like 3 different positions, cheek by jowl, that don't fit together. And as Van Manen and others pointed out, these epistles appear to be patchwork quilts that people have continued to insert their own views alongside ones they didn't agree with. We know there were several different Pauline sects in the early church, various schools of Gnosticism and the Marcionites, and in fact they're the first actual Paulinist Christians we know of. There's no other records of a church in Corinth and all this stuff that early. The Gnostics are the first to collect and comment on the epistles of Paul, and for my money, they wrote the core of the epistles, and later on people kept adding to them, including Catholic Christians who wrote the pastoral epistles to refute all the others. And so it just doesn't seem like the same person, Paul or somebody else, wrote all of this. The vocabulary is different here and there. There are major contradictions. Like in Galatians, Paul says, I didn't get my gospel from any human being, just a revelation from Christ. But in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, now let me repeat to you what I learned from those who were apostles before me, that Christ died for our sins, raised from the dead. Wait a second, this is blatantly contradictory. Which way was it? You just have different views of Paul within the epistles. So you have Paulinists with competing ideas that all wrote them down and added them to, let me correct this guy's view of Paul. And I don't think there's any way around that. You have to wind up arguing just as ridiculously as people who say that how many times did Peter deny Jesus because he's speaking to different people when he does it in different Gospels? Well, to get them all in, how about if we say Peter denied Jesus 6 times or 9 times? Get out of here. It says 3 times. They just can't get the story straight. And most people realize that's just silly, but that's what they do with the Pauline epistles. Well, if he was thinking this, he could have said this and then this, and they really mean the same thing. No, they don't. Just give it up. But they really hate saying this about the Pauline epistles, because even liberal Protestants like to go with Jesus. Well, who knows what he said, but Paul's always been the real bedrock of Christian teaching. So what, you say he didn't write this stuff? Oh no, they can't afford to admit that.
Oh, okay. So that brings me to the other point. You said that, Paul, the conversion of Paul is a myth, that he, like Constantine, he might have, like, there's a myth about Constantine's conversion of Christianity. So they might both have grown up Christian, and later on people made up the stories of converting to Christianity. Yeah, so can we know anything about the historical Paul, or is it all like murky?
It's all completely murky. I do think that Simon Magus thing is kind of a tent peg that gives us a little bit of knowledge.
Didn't you say in Romans 16 or something there's hints of Paul being from a family of
kinsmen who were in Christ before him? And that seems very strange if you look at Acts, where, no, his parents had him study with Gamaliel as a rabbinic student. That seems very odd. And the reason I take notice of that is when you look at the stories in Acts, 3 versions of it, where Paul is converted with this vision of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, they have startling similarities to the story of Pentheus's conversion to Dionysus worship after persecuting it in Euripides the Bacchae, which is hundreds of years before Christianity and well known in the Christian era, and chapter 3 of 2nd Maccabees, where Heliodorus, an agent of the Seleucid king, is going to sack the treasury of the Jerusalem temple, but is stopped in his tracks by an angel who knocks him off his horse, blinds him, and when the Jews pray for him, because they don't want to be accused of having attacked him, that he recovers and converts to Judaism. I mean, this was a widely known book as well, and it just seems to me transparent that the Paul story is modeled on these two well-known stories. And there's no hint of this Damascus Road thing in any Pauline epistle. There are references to visions and have I not seen the Lord and all that, but there's no account of this, and you surely would think there would be when Paul's apostleship is at stake, like in 2 Corinthians. He says, look, if I'm not an apostle to anybody else, I certainly am to you. I founded your church. Why wouldn't he have mentioned this incredible thing? And it seems to me Luke just decided, let me come up with something suitably earth-shaking, and borrowed it from Euripides and 2 Maccabees.
Oh, okay. So wasn't there like a split between Peterine Christianity and Pauline Christianity? Like Paul was preaching to the Gentiles and the disciples were preaching to the Jews, and then Paul and the disciples weren't getting along in theology, and they were teaching different things about Jesus and stuff like that.
That comes up in
2 Corinthians
and Galatians and Acts, this was to the credit.
Then Acts, Acts later on says that they were preaching the same thing, but Acts is rewriting history.
Exactly, well put. Yeah, F.C. Bauer pointed this out. He said that even in Acts, he is trying to paper over the chasm, and he says, have you ever noticed that every miracle and every feat that Peter does, Paul also does in Acts? They both heal a lame man. They both raise somebody from the dead. They both have a showdown with a sorcerer. They both heal in bizarre ways. Peter's shadow, Paul's handkerchief. They both preach to Gentiles. They sound the same in their preaching. And linguistic analysis shows that Luke created all the speeches in Acts, as ancient historians did. And he said it's because the author of Acts is trying to cater to both. You Paulinists out there, I know you think Peter denied Jesus and he's no good, but take a look at this. You see, he did all these things that Paul did. You Petrinists out there, I know you hate Paul and you say he persecuted Christians, but take a look at this. All the stuff Peter did, Paul did. How can you deny God is equally at work in both? So it is like a reconciliation thing, but if you look at Galatians, and I think 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that's not quite the way it is. When Peter comes to, or Cephas actually, he says, who was supposedly the same as Peter, though I doubt it. Cephas comes to Antioch and goes along with Paul. He eats with the Gentile, uncircumcised Christians, and though Peter is a Jewish Christian, Cephas is a Jewish Christian, and they're Jews and Gentiles in the church. Peter's easygoing about it until certain representatives come from James, the head of the Jerusalem church, and they seem to be more sticklers that, hey, you can't eat with those Gentiles. They're Christians, but and so he says, James's guys are here. I'll see you later. I'm going to the kosher table. And Paul comes in and says, what do you think you're doing? A hypocrite, and so on. He says, don't we all agree that it's faith in Christ that saves? If you think you got to be circumcised, you're just negating the whole thing. What's the point of Christ then? And so he says he challenged him publicly, and he says even Barnabas was carried away with this pretense. Well, we don't see any of that in Acts, though. Well, then he says that in Galatians that he and Barnabas had gone to Jerusalem previously to consult with the pillars, the Jewish apostles, and that they agreed that okay, Gentiles don't have to get circumcised, keep the Torah, but you deal with them, we'll deal with Jews. Okay, well, that's automatically suspicious, like you're dividing up the world mission between two gods. Anyway, and he says, they gave Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship with the stipulation that we collect money for the Jerusalem church because we got a bigger clientele. So set up your Patreon account and get the donations to the church. And then in Romans, he says, well, I'm going to take that collection to the Jerusalem saints. Pray with me that they'll find it acceptable. Huh? Well, this seems to reflect the fact that, as we can see right around the corner between the lines in Acts, that when Paul brought contribution, they threw it right back at him, and that things didn't stay reconciled. And this is what we see in the Simon Mega story in Acts. Simon is Paul, and he sees Peter dispensing the Holy Spirit by the laying on of hands, and he says, gee, I'd like to be able to do that. Here's a few bucks if you could teach me how, because he thinks it's a magic trick. And he says, Peter says to Simon, literally, to hell with you and your money. May your money perish with you, that you thought you could buy the gift of God with money. You have neither part nor lot in this ministry, and I can see you in hell right now, etc., etc. Well, Bauer pointed out, doesn't this sound familiar? Isn't this really a version of Paul trying to buy apostolic credentials by saying, look, I got plenty of people, I can raise money for you? Oh, okay, in that case, he says, surely this is what Luke has done with the story of what really happened. So you can pretty easily see there's this huge strife between these groups, and a lame attempt in later years, once it was all a moot point, to try to paper it over. Oh, no, Christians always got along hunky-dory, everything was fine. But it wasn't. And there's even evidence of Jewish Christian factional strife, followers of James versus followers of Peter, and many different Hellenistic, Pauline sects, and that's why Eusebius wrote his ecclesiastical history in the 4th century, to iron out all the stuff, the subsequent strife. It's so fascinating.
Oh, okay. So Acts is, for lack of a better term, full of shit, right? It's just it's contradicting Paul's.
Yeah, Paul is now a Pharisee who keeps the law still. What? I mean, that's even in Philippians and I think 2 Corinthians, where he says, "Well, I used to be a Pharisee and I used to keep the law, but now I'm freed from that in Christ." What? You're just not getting any straight story.
Oh, okay.
Herbal salad from Dr. Price.
Okay, now we're gonna move on to Bart Ehrman. Me and Bob have something in common. We're both friends with Bart Ehrman. We both get along great with Bart Ehrman.
And both devilishly handsome.
Who, me and Ehrman, or
me and you?
Okay, so what are your thoughts on Bart Ehrman's books? Because I know you have good things to say about forgery and Jesus Interrupted and misquoting Jesus and stuff like that. But the problem was with Did Jesus Exist? That book, and your thoughts on the debate you recently had. Was it in October 2016?
I think.
Yeah. Okay. Right. October 2016. It's on the internet. It's Bart Ehrman versus Robert M. Price. Did Jesus Exist? So if you want to look that up on YouTube or on Bart Ehrman's blog or whatever. So yeah, your thoughts on Bart Ehrman. Are you still in contact with them? Would you do another debate with them? Would you work with them again? And that's right. Bob is writing a book called Bart Ehrman Interpreted. That's coming out in April this year, and it's already on Amazon for pre-order. So I highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to it. So your thoughts on Bart Ehrman?
Well, I like him very much. We're friends, and he's a fine guy. he, like me, began his biblical study as an evangelical, a conservative, and gradually found himself unable to affirm that anymore, a very similar path. But I have the impression, and I am no mind reader, it's just an impression that he is still thinking inside the box of evangelical apologetics. His mentor, the great Bruce Metzger, who I had the privilege of having a class with at Princeton, they're both textual critics, Bart and Metzger, and Metzger was also something of an apologist and wrote an article where he gives the standard account that the other dying and rising gods were post-Jesus, which is demonstrably not the case, but it was the standard apologetic line. And it seems to me that some of these elements linger in Barth's work, certain axioms of conservative traditional scholarship, such as the idea that Paul at least wrote the lucky 7 epistles, as I call them, that he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, 1st Thessalonians, Philemon, Philippians. And to my satisfaction, F.C. Bauer, back in the 19th century, demonstrated that Paul couldn't have written any more than 1st and 2nd Corinthians, most of Romans, and Galatians. So even Bultmann, supposedly so critical, backslid to the 7 after Bauer argued it was 4. But I also find convincing the Dutch radical scholars like W.C. van Manen, who argued that Paul, if you use the same criteria, you can show that Paul couldn't have written even the 4 Hauptbriefe, the 4 principal epistles. And this is just not on Barth's radar. I was in the Westar Institute's Paul seminar, and my mentor and colleague Darrell Dowdy and I were talking about this Dutch radical thing. Even the supposedly super critical Jesus seminar people practically laughed us out of the room. And it's just so alien, because Protestant theology of all stripes really depends on Paul more than Jesus. So Paul is the sacred ark of the covenant, and anybody that dares touch it winds up in the ditch like Uzzah in 2 Samuel. So I found it difficult to debate with Barth because there is so little common ground. I'm operating in a totally different paradigm. Like he actually started laughing when I said Paul didn't write Galatians, though this is an old view. Rudolf Steck, the teacher of Karl Barth, believed this, and it's been argued a long time, but it's just shoved out of consideration in any seminaries or grad schools. He readily dismisses the Christ myth theory because he lumps all of the mythicist scholars together and picks out things that he thinks are demonstrably false without, I think, adequately taking it into consideration. Like, I had the impression he hadn't really read the books, mine, Earl Doherty's, Brody's, various others, Frank Zindler, because he didn't seem to be acquainted with enough of it to be able to address it. My opening statement in that debate was a response point by point to his major argument in Did Jesus Exist? Yet he didn't address some of my criticisms, such as that his approach is often circular. He'll say that a typical evangelical apologetic, there wouldn't have been enough time between Jesus and the Gospels for Jesus to become mythicized. And it seems obvious to me that applies, I think it's wrong anyway, but the apologists that say that mean that, well, of course there was a historical Jesus, but he couldn't have been embellished into a miracle worker in the brief time, several decades, between Jesus and the writing of the Gospels. That's not the point in our debate. The question is, was there a historical Jesus at the beginning of Christianity? And if you say no, Jesus is a sort of distillation of various mystery cult myths and so on, when do you even say it started? There's no birth date of an individual. If the whole thing is mythical, it makes no sense to say, well, from the starting point to the Gospels, not enough time. What's the starting point? The Osiris cult? It's just like, well, at any rate, he has certain ideas like no one would make up the notion of a crucified Messiah. It must have been something forced on the Christians. Their Messiah, Jesus, was crucified. Whoops. What sense can we make of this? Well, maybe it was a redemptive death. But this was unheard of in Jewish messianism, Barth and apologists say. I think it is not at all, because Jewish messianism comes from the sacred king mythology in ancient Israel that is on display throughout the Old Testament. And the king was the Son of God, or the God incarnate, the vicar of God on earth. And he underwent ritual humiliation, a symbolic death and resurrection every year, as the kings of Babylon and Canaan city-states did, to renew the vegetation. So the idea of a messianic divine king suffering, dying, and rising to redeem the world, this is a very ancient idea. It wasn't something early Christians cooked up. And this I know from reading a bunch of the Scandinavian myth and ritual scholars, Mowinckel, Gunkel, Engnell, Geo Wiedengren, but I don't see any airplay of that stuff in Did Jesus Exist? So it just seems to me he's within an apologetic box still, and that's easy to understand, but I think that if you consider a wider range of sources and get rid of this circularity and the consensus fallacy, I think that is to be found all over the place in his work. Unfortunately, perhaps I'm misunderstanding it, but most people seem to think so. That he says, well, look, most scholars think this is wrong. The consensus of scholars, all the in crowd at the Society of Biblical Literature, the consensus of scholars is that there was a historical Jesus. If you don't think so, you must be a nut, a conspiracy theorist, 9/11 truther, Holocaust denier, all this stuff. Well, I always like to say, the consensus of scholars in the Gospels was that Jesus should be put to death. Were they right? You can't take a nose count, as Francis Schaeffer used to say. It really does not matter epistemologically what most people think. I mean, was the earth flat when most people thought so? And this is what happens in the succession of paradigms in science, in literary studies, in history. You have a paradigm, a framework for interpreting the evidence. And if you can make sense of the evidence, but there's always data that doesn't quite fit, and so eventually someone will start with that data, construct a new framework, a new way to interpret the data, and if it's cogent, gradually everybody will come around to it. But it's going to be a tough fight, as it should be, because you've really got to prove your point. It's not easy. So there's whenever a new paradigm replaces an old one, as in Old Testament minimalism, it's going to be a long fight, but the minority view may become the majority view. I won't live long enough to see that happen, and I don't really care if it happens. I'm not part of some Jesus mythicist sect. I don't care. It's just a theory that makes the most sense to me.
Oh, okay. So Yeah, well, see, I like Barterman's books, Forged and stuff like that. But
Oh yeah, he's done some goodies.
yeah, okay, so can you briefly give us your criticism of Did Jesus Exist? Because you and Richard Carrier said that book sucks. So, yeah.
Well, despite there's the differences I just outlined, which are more in basic principle, but it does seem to me that he does not accurately represent the views of myself and Earl Doherty, who's written some great stuff on this, Acharya S., Dorothy Murdoch. I've written a real damning critique of her, but she's changed her stripes since then and took the criticisms to heart and has written much better stuff. But he blasts us and assumes we're sort of like the old parable of the laundrymen who make their living doing each other's wash. He doesn't distinguish sufficiently between the very different approaches some of us take, and he doesn't seem to get what we're saying. And I don't know why that is. Like he says that I use the criteria of dissimilarity to show that Jesus most likely didn't say this or that. He says, well, the criterion of dissimilarity is aimed at finding what Jesus did say, not what he didn't. It's really two ways of saying the same thing, and I was amazed. He inferred that, and he claims that this very strange statue in the Vatican that Acharya mentions is sort of this an odd thing that shows weird things were going on back then in religion that had just been ignored. He says she made this up, only she didn't, and she documented it and so on. And Earl Doherty, he doesn't get Earl's point, which is pretty clear, I think. So my guess is that his research assistants failed him. Many faculty at highfalutin schools have research assistants, which is how you can do so many books. Like Bart really churns them out, and they're like the forgery and counter-forgery, exhaustive in its treatment. Jesus Before the Gospels does all kinds of stuff with oral tradition theories. Great research, really good stuff. My favorite is books, The Orthodox Corruption of Scriptures, based on a whole lot of research, and that's not shameful. I mean, you have these Santa's elves working for you, doing research you don't have time to do. They just say, okay, here's some relevant stuff we've culled, and Joachim Jeremias did that. A lot of scholars do that. There's nothing discreditable about that, but so my criticism is more of his research assistants who rounded up material they thought he should read to critique, but it wasn't enough stuff. It wasn't in context, and I think it misrepresents us. But not in everything he says, of course, but that's the impression I was left with. I was sort of astonished.
Oh, okay.
He's so brilliant and does so many great books. This just did not seem to me to be an adequate treatment. I hope he does another book on mythicism and does a more comprehensive criticism of it.
Do you think he has an emotional stake in it because on Jesus Exists, because most of his work and his career revolve around historical Jesus? So do you think he has like an emotional investment in the history of Jesus and things like that?
Well, yeah. Like, for instance, Gerhard Ludemann got into considerable trouble for his critical work on Jesus, though he does believe there was a historical Jesus. But I know for a fact he had a kind of nostalgic, sentimental attachment to the gospel Jesus. And even though he's kind of agnostic, he still kind of wishes there was this canonical Jesus. Well, it might be that Bart feels that way, but I doubt it. I think he's pretty much resigned himself to agnosticism and atheism. But the historical Jesus thing, it wouldn't surprise me. Like, I think it's just very difficult for him to even entertain that as a plausible thing, and I think my guess, like I'm no mind reader, but I wonder if it's what Peter Berger calls a plausibility structure. What seems plausible to your peer group automatically seems plausible to you, or you start looking for other peer group. And Barth defines professional New Testament scholarship as a guild of people that reject the Christ myth theory. I mean, many other things too, but for him, it's automatically fringe crackpot scholarship, and so he cannot, because everybody thinks so. He knows that if he were to espouse this, his colleagues say, what's happened to you? You having a breakdown or something? And I don't think he consciously figures, I don't dare take this seriously or I'm out of a job. I really don't think that. But I suspect it's the plausibility structure thing. Well, I know that's not sound scholarship. Why bother with it? It's just an disinclination to think out of the box. I have respect for him, so I don't attribute any kind of neurotic or disingenuous motives. I really don't.
He's a good guy.
Yeah, and I know I sound like I'm undermining him, trying to psychoanalyze him. I'm not. It's just that I respect him so much. I need to come up with some explanation as to why I think he's wrong on this. But that's all it is. It's just my guess and understanding.
It's just a scholarly disagreement on things.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And it's a surprising one. So I wonder, well, how'd that happen? But that's really the only status of what I'm saying. I certainly don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I get along with him, you get along with him, yeah, so it's just we can have our disagreements.
Well, I tell you what it's kind of like is my political disagreement, where there are loads of people I love and respect that voted for a candidate that I cannot imagine voting for. It utterly mystifies me. But they're intelligent people, so I said, well, who cares, really?
Yeah, we're going to talk about politics in a little bit. Okay, so final question on religion, is there a dangerous way to look at the world through the Bible that may harm societies like racism, anti-Islamic mindsets, Islamophobia, etc., etc.? Is there a dangerous way to look at the world through the Bible that may harm society or societies?
Well, the only thing I know of that you could say actually is based on the Bible would be Christian Reconstructionism, also known as Dominionism. I guess they're slightly different things. But Rousas John Rushdoony, who was I think a friend of Cornelius Van Til, a particular kind of Calvinist philosopher, he argued in a book called Institutes of Biblical Law, followed by Gary North with a book called Theonomy and various others. He argued that the civil law of the Old Testament is not negated by the new covenant in Christ, and the United States should adopt biblical law. He says for this to happen, you would have to convince enough Americans to vote it into being. He's not for some theocratic, he wasn't for any kind of theocratic takeover. So the guy wasn't a fanatic, but he had this, I think, sophistic worldview based on the Bible, like stoning adulterers and homosexuals and all that. To me, one of my favorite theologians, Bugs Bunny, put it well when he said, I made a wrong point in Albuquerque. Rushdoony made a wrong turn somewhere. If you're coming up with a view that says you got to stone gays and adulterers to death, look, buddy, this can't be right. There's a miscalculation somewhere. But that's the closest thing to someone actually trying to apply alien ethics from the Bible to modern life. And if it ever happened, that would be very bad. It'd be like Christian Taliban. But it's impossible. It's never going to happen. And most fundamentalists who know about this reject it. Norman Geisler, Charles Colson, these people are fanatics. So I don't think there's a whole lot of danger. There are weird fringe groups, like there's a kind of Christian equivalent to ISIS in Latin America, where they commit crimes against unbelievers who don't count. And that's crazy. I mean, I just don't think you can find that in the Bible. And they're the Christian identity nuts with this racist mythology that they ultimately got from Nazis. And, people like to say, oh, I don't like these guys, they're Nazis. I mean, these guys actually were dependent on the Nazis. And in terms of Islamophobia, I find that really puzzling and unhelpful insofar as people don't understand about Islam and sloppily group all Muslims together, which they would never do with Christians, for instance. That, all right, that's Islamophobia, phobia meaning an irrational fear. But if you don't garble the whole thing and you say, gee, we ought to take precautions against terrorists who may smuggle themselves in among the legitimate immigrants from Middle Eastern countries, that's no phobia. And you can debate whether it's a wise policy or not, but that's just prudential, regrettable scrutiny you're having to exercise. But even that has little necessarily to do with Islam, which is really a whole different thing. I mean, I think some of the Sharia law is based on ancient Arabic culture, even tribal mores and all of that. But I've studied Islam in detail for years. I've read the Quran in 4 different translations, the whole thing, and I tend to read it more. I love and am fascinated by Islam, but I really have a great distaste for terrorists who happen to be Islamic. And of course, the two are not simply equivalent. You can find murderous fanatics of no religion or of different religions. So
the problem's not with Islam, the problem's with Muslims, or the problem's not with Christianity, the problem's with Christians and so. Because Christianity also has a bloody history. Christians have a bloody history of genocide, racism. What else? The Crusades. There's all kinds of bloody history in Christian history. So would you say the problem with Christians and Muslims, or does Christianity and Islam bring that out in people?
Well, Stalinism was at least as bad, and that was atheistic. This crazy thing where some atheists say that religion is the problem, religion is a deadly virus. Come off it. I mean, there are things like opposing science. Yeah, that comes from it. But even there in the Soviet Union, they fostered Lysenkoism because it was more favorable to, or more analogous to socialism. Well, that was imposing dogma on science. It's just this is the foibles of stupid humans. I mean, all of these things really are Protestant Catholic strife. Is there anything in Protestantism or Catholicism that would naturally result in this? It's just people, or a lot of people are stupid or immature or vicious, and religion becomes a flag for that.
Oh, okay. So the problem's not with Christianity and Islam. The problem's with Christians and Muslims. So okay, I get it. Is there like a worse Christian fundamentalist you had to deal with? Because the worst Christian fundamentalist I had to deal with was probably James White. He's just a nasty old prick. But is there like a worse Christian fundamentalist you had to deal with?
Well, with James White, I debated him, and I got along great with him. I'm sorry you had
me and Bart Ehrman, we don't like him.
I know. I was lucky to have a real pleasant, friendly interchange with him.
He's a nasty old prick.
I found William Lane Craig, though personable, he struck me as sort of a used car salesman, that I thought he was using cheap debating stunts, misrepresenting me, and then I correct it, and then he gives the same misrepresentation back. And
didn't you say he's like a used car salesman?
Yeah, that he's. It just seems oily to me, and that he's just giving like Dwayne Gish always did this creationist. He'd be soundly refuted in debate after debate and wouldn't change a thing. He just kept selling the same, like Jehovah's Witnesses at your door. Good luck having a dialogue with them. Mormons, yes, they'll actually discuss things with you, but Jehovah's Witnesses apparently are told you just get out there and sell those brushes like a Fuller brush, and they got a lot of guts. I admire them for that, but that's kind of what some of these apologists are like. Yeah. There's no way they're going to consider any other perspective.
Okay, because I think you and Richard Carrier have something in common. You both debated William Lane Craig. Mm-hmm. And Richard, I was talking about this with Richard because Richard was he came on my show back in October 2016. October 2016. He was saying that William Lane Craig's like a douchebag on stage, and he said that William Lane Craig's like a very fake person, like there's a mask, like you don't know, you're not talking to the real person. Do you have that same impression?
Yeah, I'd say so. He's like he's got a persona.
He's a very fake person. That's what Carrier said. Is that?
I hate to say it, but I got that impression also.
You see that too?
Yeah, it seemed to me that, I mean, there are other people where they'll say things I'm very surprised to hear, but I don't doubt for a second that this is their true opinion, and they don't mind being vulnerable about it. But he just strikes me as like a political spin doctor. I guess that'd be an even better comparison. You listen, no matter what candidate, what public figure, when they have spin doctors, well, I know my candidate lost the election, but if you look at it this way, he really won. And you look at the different shows, they're talking about the same events, but you'd never guess they were the same event. The coverage is so different, and I'd say that apologists are essentially spin doctors, but with Craig, it's especially egregious.
Okay, I forgot to mention about. Can you tell us the problems with the Old Testament? Why the Old Testament books like the Book of Genesis, Exodus, and the Kings and all that, the patriarchal stories, and the David and Solomon story, and why the Old Testament in general is not historically reliable, and things like that. Because fundamentalists will say, yeah, there's archaeological diggings proving the Old Testament, so
Well, there's some of it is so obviously mythic, like Adam and Eve and Noah and the Ark, that you really, I don't know how people can defend that as history with a straight face. That's just, I remember one Southern Baptist guy, a seminary administrator, said something like, I don't know how a man can be in the ministry if he doesn't believe in a literal Adam and Eve. And I thought, I don't know how you can not be in the insane asylum if you do. It just doesn't work, and it's pathetic to see people try to rationalize it and harmonize it with paleontology. My friend Ed Suomen and I wrote a book called Evolving Out of Eden, Christian Responses to Evolution, and we deal with all that stuff, not just the raw fundies with the creationism, but the theistic evolutionists who are more sophisticated and try to put a good face on it. Forget it doesn't work. But so that stuff's obviously myth, and don't get me started on Noah's Ark, the absurdities of that. But of course, a lot of the Old Testament is not like that, and it's apparent history with Joshua and David. I mean, people have visions of God, but of course people still do, whatever it is. Hallucinations, I don't know, but that's not implausible. But the problem is that you're reading anecdotes of what happens to individuals in private that nobody would have known to pass on. David said this, Bathsheba said that, Abraham said this, Sarah answered that. Who could have kept these private conversations alive in memory? It's just ridiculous. As Hermann Gunkel once pointed out, you're telling me that Israelites were in Egypt for 4 centuries centuries and nothing is recorded about what happened. But with Abraham and Sarah, who allegedly lived before then, we actually hear the dialogue they had over whether or not to kick out Hagar. It's absurd. It's novelistic. And that's one of the big differences between fiction writing and history, and it's obviously novelistic. So that's a huge problem. But maybe the death blow is this archaeology thing. William F. Albright, who was a Presbyterian and trying to prove that the Bible was essentially historical, he played a kind of pin the tail on the Bible game. He and his students would do archaeological digs, and if they found something that might have been a biblical location, okay, that's what it is. There's the ruins of a city under the Dead Sea, gotta be Sodom and Gomorrah. Without any real evidence. I mean, occasionally they actually have found one of these towns with its name on something, but on the whole, no. And they just, oh, this ought to be this ought to be that. Like Constantine's mother sending people to the Holy Land to find the true tomb of Jesus, the true cross, and all this stuff. How could you possibly tell after 300 years? Oh, they couldn't, and they didn't. They just, oh, here's a tomb, I guess this was it. And that's why there's more than one Golgotha, more than one tomb and all that. That's what Albright was essentially doing, and that's why apologists felt entitled to say the Bible's historicity had been vindicated by archaeology, but it hadn't. And now the methodology is different. Those assumptions are not there, and so today's archaeologists have rendered just the opposite verdict. Like, there was no great city of Jerusalem. There was no royal palace of David. There was no temple of Solomon, because you can tell whether there would be ruins, and there are not. And what happened? Did God send angels down with vacuum cleaners as if they were cleaning up a ticker tape parade on a city street? It's just ridiculous. There can't have been such a thing. There was no exodus, because we have the technology through infrared detection to uncover old caravan routes through the Sinai Desert, but there is no sign of an exodus from Egypt, no matter which hypothetical route you pick. A transition of millions of people and huge herds of cattle, no evidence. There'd be loads of evidence if it happened. It simply didn't. There was no conquest of Canaan. You would find all kinds of ruined cities. You don't. It just didn't happen. And so archaeology has put Christians in the same boat it has Mormons, because there are all kinds of statements about Nephite and Lamanite cities and armor and so on. Where? Like, there's no vestige of it. And so and of course they were really finished off by genetic testing that showed that American Indians have no Semitic or Near Eastern genes. So much for that. I mean, that blows the whole thing out of the water. And so that's like Solomon may have been based on Alexander the Great. He has a great empire. He dies, and it's divided into more than one kingdom after he does. Who knows? But it looks like the Old Testament may be written much, much later than we thought, in maybe not just a century before the New Testament. It's shocking, the re-examinations that are going on.
So there's no way to prove that, Adam, Eve, David, Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, all those Old Testament figures, those major ones, David, Solomon, and those minor ones like what's his name, Joshua and Amos and all those people, Daniel. There's no way to prove those people existed, or were they real people but put in fictional stories?
Well, it could be the latter, and with later characters like some of the kings of Israel, like Jehoshaphat and Ahaz and Omri, another version of the name Omar, interestingly. These guys do seem to have existed, and they did have a kingdom called Israel. There are extra biblical monuments that show that, but these great heroes and culture heroes and founders and all that, the problem is that if you take away the temple, what have you got left to say about Solomon? He's the great builder and all of that. If there weren't even enough people in the southern area to have a kingdom, what happens to the story of David doing a census to see how many military men he can have? It just presupposes a much later anachronistic setting. So some will try to distill some vestige and say, well, maybe there was some sort of a bandit chief that David was based on, which is exactly what they do with King Arthur. They say, well, maybe in the 6th century there was a Romano-British war chief named Arthur. Not that there's any real reason to think so. They're just saying it's like there must have been a Clark Kent. Niels Peter Lemke says these are just rationalizing paraphrases. They're trying to just give you a cloudy view of the story and get rid of all the stuff that is obviously mythic and say, well, maybe the rest of it's true. There's just no reason to do that. Any document, as David Friedrich Strauss said, is as reliable as its most unreliable feature. That if it's saying this kind of crazy thing, forget it. Whatever else it says incidentally is not to be taken seriously either.
Oh, okay, because Islam doesn't accept the Bible anyway, so I don't have any problems criticizing the Bible.
What about the people of the book thing, and that Jesus brought the Injil, David, the Psalms, and so on?
According to Islam, Jesus brought the Gospel, not the New Testament. But the Gospel is not the New Testament. The Gospel is some kind of revelation given to Jesus, not necessarily written, not necessarily a written form, but maybe like an oral message or something like that. So that's the Gospel of Jesus, but the Gospel of Jesus is not the New Testament Gospels, because the New Testament came, even the most conservative Christian apologists would say the New Testament came after Jesus. People wrote down the New Testament. Yeah. It just didn't fall out of the sky or whatever. Same thing with the Old Testament, same thing with the Torah. There was a Torah revealed to Moses. It wasn't written about Moses. Same thing with the Injil or the Gospel. It was a Gospel revealed to Jesus, not written about him.
Okay.
So Islam kind of has a different view on the Bible than like, it's not like the Protestant version or the Catholic. But doesn't the Protestant version have less books than the Catholic version?
Yeah, most Christians after a while were Greek, Greco-Roman, etc., and they read the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, which had more books in it. But the Palestinian rabbis didn't accept the books that only existed in Greek, like Tobit, Judith, Maccabees, Sirach, Wisdom of Solomon, etc. And so since most Christians were Greek speakers, they just chose the Greek Bible, I guess by default, really. And then there were some rare people that thought they shouldn't have done it. Like I think St. Jerome thought that really we ought to go with the ones that are just in Hebrew. Though he didn't mind Greek ones, he translated the whole thing into Latin. But then at the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther also thought that these books that are only in the Septuagint, well, he thought it better to go with the Palestinian Jewish, the rabbinic canon, and so he kicked out the other one. Well, actually, he didn't think there was much wrong with them. He just didn't think they were inspired scripture. The Bible, even Protestant, like the King James, until I think it was 1823, contained the Apocrypha. They just thought, well, this is edifying stuff, but it's not the infallible Word of God. Now, Protestants just say, who needs it?
Oh, okay.